I have to tell you, the world was very terrifying, right? Like it was a very scary thing, the apocalypticism that was at the heart of it. If something wasn't done, if this war wasn't won, then our families were going to suffer. Meanwhile, the books told us we were going to get thrown in camps. We were going to get branded with 666, right? Every day, and I tell this to people, and they shake their heads. We were taught how to do spiritual battle with Satan in case he showed up in our house.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and this is my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. We are live on Facebook. It will be on YouTube and many other places that you can watch and listen, and then as a podcast in many podcast places where you can listen. And if you like the podcast, please like it in the online interweb sense. I'm talking with a friend of mine, Jared Yates Sexton, today, who is an author of multiple books. And today we're zeroing in on his new book, which is just released now, The Midnight Kingdom. And we're going to talk at length about this book. So, Jared, would you just give me the subtitle so I don't screw it up? Because I'm reading from the screen here and I should put my glasses on, but read the subtitle to me.
Well, first of all, Frank, it's always good to see you and get a chance to talk. The subtitle is A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis.
Okay, so there's a lot of places to go here. I have read the first 5 chapters word for word. I ran out of some time this morning and then jumped to the last chapter and the epilogue. I've read your notes and then I skimmed the ones in the middle. So I want to start by saying that, first of all, it's extremely well written and captivating. It's interesting for me because you know a little bit about my family history and a project that I produced and directed as a film series called How Should We Then Live, with my father, Francis Schaeffer, the evangelical theologian, which of course covered exactly the same material you cover, beginning with Constantine and the Romans and the Empire and the French Revolution and the Protestant Reformation, Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire, and all the rest of it. I mean, literally, the chapter structure is almost identical. It also ends up with a call to action. These books are mirror images that draw opposite conclusions. In part of your growth as a human, at some stage you ran into my dad's work as kind of reading that a young evangelical had to do. Looking at the biographical section of your book, the way it starts in the opening with talking about your grandmother's apocalyptic views and so forth and so on, she was kind of absorbing what you might call, and I don't mean this to sound condescending at all, but I don't know how to put this, the kind of less educated, bottom-dwelling, evangelical prophetic voice of the televangelists and so forth that my dad would have seen himself as very distinct from. You came out of that background, at some place ran into my dad. So before we get into your book, talk a little bit about your journey from the evangelical world, which, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but at one point I would have imagined you would have accepted pretty much as gospel my dad's version, his evangelical spin on history, the rise of capitalism, democracy, all rooted, as he would have put it, in the fruits of the gospel, the Reformation, Martin Luther, Calvin, all these people, in a kind of a triumphalist way of saying, look, we have the truth. Our job now is to spread the gospel. Look at all the great things it has done. Kind of the opposite conclusion that your book draws that we're going to get into in a moment. But before we get into your book, talk about your journey from someone in their 20s who might have bought into everything that my dad was talking about to where you are today, writing The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis, taking the opposite point of view. That's much too long a question, but you know what I'm after. I just like a little personal context.
Yeah, absolutely. And Frank, like I said, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, but it's always so strange. Before I ever knew who you were, or even who your father was, your influences weighed very heavily on my life. As a child, I grew up in a very extreme evangelical conspiracy theory ridden culture. We would go to church every Sunday, and our pastor would talk almost explicitly about the book of Revelation, that we were living in the end times and that we were in the middle of a holy war, which, by the way, I'm sure your listeners understand is now the root of Christian nationalism and Trumpism and every other, main component of right-wing reactionary ideology now. I grew up also in terms of my grandmother. She was the type of person, if things would have broken right for her, she would have been an intellectual. She was very intelligent, very, very smart. She wanted to do research to understand what was happening, but she didn't have an extensive education. She took what was given to her, which was a lot of right-wing hokum. There's no other way to put it, right? Yeah. We're talking about everything from books about the New World Order to Reader's Digest, angels, demons, ghosts, right?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm interrupting you for a second just to tell listeners that Jared's book is terrific in many ways. So let me zero in on the first thing that's fantastic. And that is that the opening of your book, talking about your grandmother, is like the opening of a novel. You're a really good writer. And as someone who writes novels himself and writes for a living, I just want to let people know that when they read this book, they're in the hands of a master storyteller. And the way you open this book, talking about your grandmother's delusional kind of world that she's building while trying to understand the larger world and what's happening to her working class family, I just think is brilliant. I mean, it's a standalone essay that I would put up against any piece of writing, period. So that said, let's continue.
Well, Frank, it's a mutually admiration society that we have going here. You're a beautiful writer, and that means a lot to me. My grandmother, she basically did her own independent research, what we would now call in the QAnon world, baking, right? Like putting these things together, trying to understand. And what she was trying to understand was politics. She was trying to understand the economy. We had a working labor family, factory workers, service workers, miners, all that.
Yeah.
She wanted to understand why the family had suffered so much, why, the Great Depression had happened, why our family could never get ahead, why they suffered economically, why they lived shorter lives, why they suffered. And as she did that, the only information and the only context and the only frame that she had was the evangelical right-wing reactionary concepts. Now, as I was doing that, we eventually would have moments where, your work and your father's work would be brought in sort of as and it's sort of the intellectual backbone of this stuff. And that was like a large part of what you all served for. This was seen almost as like a pseudo intellectualism within the community. We would people would recognize that at 7, 8, 9 years old, that I was an inquisitive, intelligent young man, young kid. Whatever. And they would, they'd say, hey, take a look at this. Or, it would air on TV and we would sit down and watch it, as like a small family. And as that happened, I have to tell you, the world was very terrifying. Right? It was a very scary thing, the apocalypticism that was at the heart of it. If something wasn't done, if this war wasn't won, then our families were going to suffer. Meanwhile, the books told us we were going to get thrown in camps. We were going to get branded with 666, right? Every day, and I tell this to people and they shake their heads. We were taught how to do spiritual battle with Satan in case he showed up in our house.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't a metaphorical thing. It was a real malevolent being that was, a puppet master behind the scenes, which, by the way, is anti-Semitic, really, when you get down to the root of it. But it was this evil, malevolent being who would show up in your house, come for your soul. Your friends would make sure that you would get possessed, that you would end up going on the wrong path. And the entire point of this is that there were appeals that were honed. And that they affected my life, they affected my family. It, by the way, has created a situation now. My grandmother is long since dead, but the people she raised, my cousins, my neighbors, my community members, same ones who were in these churches, they now believe QAnonism. They now believe Trumpism. All of these things have become a main line because of the background programming that was there.
Let me get back to something else here, and thank you for that. And just tell people again that you really want to read this book, and you will not put it down once you get into the introduction with this story about his grandmother's influence and just how Jared grew up. We're talking about The Midnight Kingdom, which is just coming out. If I was one of those people that had, like those old movie reviews, sort of 1 balloon or 5 or something, it has my highest rating. This is the Michelin 3-star book. It's really well written and it's terrific. Now, let me get into the substance of the book a little bit. How to sum it up if I was writing a review? I mean, in terms of my background and being the person who produced How Should We Then Live, which became this kind of standard work on history and art and theology for a generation of evangelicals. For anybody who read that book or grew up on it, I'll just say this, and that Jared's book is the antidote. And if you had the ability to go back in time and hand this book, minus the last 2 chapters, which would be more up to the moment, post-Reagan, and we wrote ours before that, but minus that, you would, in a way, word for word, line for line, example by example, have a refutation of my dad's thesis. In many ways, there'd be a few places you overlap and would agree on some basic facts. But what interests me is that you've drawn an entirely different conclusion when it comes to the whole neoliberal marriage to capitalism and this kind of soulless world we live in, where, and you have a terrific bit toward the end of the book, sort of talking about going to outer space and everything is not going to solve our present problems, and a sort of a rebuke to the tech folks. But I guess the part of the book that I find most intriguing is the way you lay the history of the marriage of state power and hierarchy with a view of Christianity, which solidifies it as God's will, almost the divine right of kings carried into other contexts of capitalism, and even in the French Revolution into just state power. Right. So I don't want to nibble at the edges of this. I'd like to jump into your main thesis. Yeah. Tell us the main thesis of the book and explain your view of history. I know it's a tall order to do when you've just written the book. I've got all sorts of quotes marked that I'd like to read if we had 2 hours instead of 1. But I want you to give us the thesis of the book and let people know why I'm so energized by it, and why I hope they will be.
Well, a couple of things here. One, I want to point out, because in the past week that this book has been out, I've received a lot of hate from particularly evangelicals who say that this is an anti-Christian book. I would go ahead and make the argument that this is not an anti-Christian book. It's not an anti-religion book. It's an anti-heretical religion book, right? Which is the idea that, Christianity, you can be an adherent to it and not use it in order to oppress people. You can believe it's about lifting people up out of poverty. It's about empathy. It's about even solidarity, if you want to take it towards a more leftist idea of things. The entire argument of this is that the way that our world works depends on stories. It depends on narratives. That's how people understand how the world works, and how those stories are formed has everything to do with how the world has moved forward. Starting with Rome, which people might not know this, when Rome's internal mythology, the imperial cult, the idea that emperors were divinely inspired or gods themselves, when that started flagging, Christianity was the antidote to that. It replaced the mythology. And from there, all the way into this modern moment, Christianity's a couple of components of it, and you know this as well as I do, apocalypticism. The idea that if we don't fight back, or if we don't do this, then the world is going to end in a terrible fashion. Satan is going to win. People are going to suffer. That makes sure that everything from elections, right, are overturnable. That makes sure that democracy is not compatible with this worldview. There's also the idea of what St. Augustine would call either holy persecution or rightful persecution. This is the idea that if you have God on your side, then whatever you do to other people, it doesn't matter because you are serving a higher purpose, right?
Can I just say that in setting that up, and early in the book, you write, my journey through the past in search of answers and trying to understand the mystical, this mythical Western civilization begins with the merging of power and Christianity in Rome. And here's the point I found so interesting. The Christian faith, with its monotheistic focus, missionary impulse, reliance on divinely revealed knowledge, and twin interlocking elements of martyrdom and the utility of power, all of it protected by apocalyptic narrative, was world-altering development. The decline of the mythology of Rome's exceptionalism turned Christianity from a persecuted sect to the defining ideology and worldview of the Western world. And what I found so interesting about this, Jared, and something I'd never thought of before, which is a high compliment for your book, is the fact that I had not seen how the impulse of imperial Rome had dovetailed so conveniently with the beginnings of Christianity. Because, of course, as you know from your background, we were always told we were sort of the Christians were the martyrs and these were the bad guys. Actually, the martyrs soon adopted the ideology of the oppressor. And that thesis you make in the first chapters of the book, I think, is just brilliant. I mean, if that's all your book was about, it's an eye-opener. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, but people need to know this is really different and it's really good.
So with that, I want to point out two things. One, I know is absolutely on your radar because you participated in it, but in the other one, it's something that isn't. I'll start with the second, which is there are even scholars now, people who are the marriage between Christianity and the Roman Empire was so convenient that there are people now who say, well, Christianity was basically a state mythology. It was created for that purpose because it is so convenient how they came together. But I think it's more obvious looking at what happened in the late 1970s, early 1980s with Reaganism and the evangelical right, moving away, of course, from Jimmy Carter into this reactionary conservative movement. We know that people like Jerry Falwell, who was never actually a true believer, we know now from Jerry Falwell Jr. that, his father was an opportunist. He was a power monger. And as you look at how those sort of like state powers and also religious powers come together, it was a marriage of convenience. It was, at some point or another, you allow these mythologies to take place. And as they do, they reinforce both sides. So it is really, really obvious that this won over so-called pagan religions that were more utilitarian, that were more open and free. The one I keep talking about in the beginning chapter is the cult of Isis, which has more or less been destroyed because it had equality between the sexes. It had respect for the environment. It had an admiration for science and empiricism. And of course, Christianity, when sort of turned and made heretical, went against all of those things. And so as a result, it was like an easy decision that's what ended up merging with state power.
Yeah, and one of the things you write is that several features of Christian monotheism made it especially potent as a replacement mythology for the imperial cult of Rome. As the mythology lost its luster and appeal, the creation of in-groups and out-groups inspired by divine intention, with a system of supernatural rewards and punishments to entice fealty and stave off disruptions, meant that Rome's fragile order could be revitalized. And that's something that I find so intriguing about your book, was this sort of idea, and Mary Beard gets into this a little bit in her analysis of Rome as well. Beard talks about the fact that in a way, she ends her series on the BBC about the Roman Empire saying, well, really, it never ended. It just became the Christian empire. And she makes that point, but she didn't make it as well as you did. And she doesn't really explain it. You do a better job than Beard did on this. And I have, in reading your book, I've kind of understood this in a completely new way. Let's just get into that a little bit.
Well, real fast, and by the way, that is high praise. I think Mary Beard did incredible work, but I also think that there's something that we can learn about this, which is, you're exactly right. Christianity outlasted the Roman Empire. It became the defining ideology. And of course, that's what feudalism was. Feudalism was this type of world where Christianity was on top and everything flowed down from it, right?
Sure.
Eventually, when feudalism breaks, and there's tons of reasons why it happened, and we can learn from that, and there's think about it, it's replaced with capitalism.
Well, later in your book, you talk about how Martin Luther came out on the side of the princes and the slaughter of the peasants, who in a way took his Protestant idea seriously, and then they got killed for actually implementing what he seemed to be saying. But he wasn't saying that. He was saying, no, the hierarchy is the divine order. Some are meant to lead, some are meant to follow, some are meant to serve, the same kind of thing that always undergirded slavery at some point.
And there's a really important lesson to learn from all of this. So I'm so glad we're talking about it. When people think about the Reformation, or they think about the American Revolution, whenever there are these revolutionary moments, everyone thinks that revolution means that everything has been torn down and there's just been tossed up. No, it's the second in command taking over for the first in command. Religion then becomes subjugated. And what happens, and this is important for the moment and what we need to understand about our current time, capitalism becomes imbued with Christianity, right? This is the idea that God shines on people who profit. There's a Calvinist idea behind this.
Yeah.
And Lutherans look at this too. There's like the work ethic, of course. But capitalism has also done the exact same thing that Christianity did with Rome.
Yes.
People don't understand this, that the British Empire, of course, was the defining empire of the world. It was what made capitalism move. Eventually, capitalism, as its own force, the same way Christianity did, kind of decides to leave Britain and moves to America, and America becomes the center of the world.
Yeah,
and
what interests me too on that point is a quote from your book saying the Christian impulse to destroy any traces of secular scholarship was rooted deep in the faith, stemming from the origin story of the Garden of Eden, in which Adam and Eve infamously betrayed God's command to not eat from the tree of knowledge. To rectify this ancient mistake, Christians lashed out at any and all works representing, quote, barbarous and atheistic arrogance, and were ordered to avoid, quote, strange and diabolical texts, including the vast stores of amassed knowledge in the sciences. They attacked libraries, burning books, and smashing all traces of, and then it continues, very much ripped from the headlines today with the kind of book banning going on, as you have this idea in a through line all the way to our own moment.
And the only way that we understand it now is what we've been fed, which is this is what ISIS does.
Right.
And if you actually look at what happens when Christianity gains power, it wipes out all of the knowledge of the ancient world.
And I just want to say again, it again, because it's really a brilliant point you make in your book, in imitation and continuation of what Rome did with those who would not toe the line in their monotheistic system.
Yep.
So, I don't think people quite get that. The continuation of the same impulse. The Christian era did not do something new. What it did was it's a continuation of a past. And now we find that continuation right up to our moment of history.
Exactly. And, everything that we're watching right now, and it's very eerie having written this book. It's very eerie having looked at how authoritarian energies, they always follow the exact same conspiracy theories. They follow the exact same ideology, the in-groups, the out-groups, the positive persecution, the apocalypticism. And what do? They tell people, oh, the teachers are out to get you. We have to take over the schools. Oh, the books are evil. We have to get rid of the books. All of these things continue to go forward, and they continue to recycle themselves. And
they also have a root in the past. Again, from your book, Augustine thus reduced the Roman Empire to a stepping stone for Christianity, which survived its fall to ensure eternal salvation and the victory of good over evil. Christians would need to destroy all the earthly remnants of arrogant human civilization and purge humanity of evil. In that pursuit, Christians continued the annihilation of temples and libraries and murdered the remaining pagans, non-believers, and public intellectuals, including, and it goes on to list the people. So once again, that impulse, it's not like what I love about your book, sorry to keep interrupting you, but your book is really good, is that almost, I'm always worried about a book that lays a historical foundation for the point it really wants to make.
Right.
And it's like, okay, we'll get through this bit and then we'll get to what he's really talking about. What's amazing to me is the most topical, ripped from the headlines moments of your book, as it were, are in some of the earlier chapters about Rome and early history, because the through line
it's right there.
Is right there. And it's always been there from the beginning. And of course, this is where it's so different from the way my dad analyzed it, which was somehow Christianity good, everything else bad. Yours has flipped it and just said, look, it isn't that Christianity's bad, but don't pretend that it changed everything. It merely continued the imperial impulse.
Well, and one of the problems, and this is actually a weaponized idea that the evangelical right has used, and why I wanted to go after Western civilization, so-called, in the first place. Your dad's thesis was very obvious, which is that time moves in a linear fashion, that it is always getting better, that things are always improving, that the past was bad or ugly, but we learned from it. We've moved forward. There are elements that we moved forward. In fact, a real view of history is it just continues to cycle itself. The things that change are the systems that operate, and you can move backwards. That's one of the main problems that we have right now is we're facing this authoritarian, neo-fascistic, evangelical, international movement, right? That is looking to roll back the progress of the 20th century the exact same way that a Benito Mussolini or an Adolf Hitler did. And what did Mussolini and Hitler do? They realized that history is a cycle and you can move it backwards and you can go ahead and get rid of all of the progress. And how do you do it? You do it by bastardizing religious ideology, which is why fascism, of course, leaned on the Catholic Church and why Nazism leaned on the Lutheran Church. They went ahead and they used it and they turned it from an ideology that people believed already, that was already their background faith, and then they mutated it as the Catholic Church worked with fascists and as the Lutheran Church worked with Nazis. So as you see this, it is this idea that we have that everything's going to move forward, will be fine, but it is a continual wrestling over what direction we move in.
We were taught, and that, by the way, is where my dad and you would agree. History and ideas matter to
Yes.
Jared Yates Sexton and to Francis Schaeffer and to me, for the record. But you draw very different conclusions and look at things less through the prism of an ideology that has to be defended, and more, your worldview is let the chips fall where they may.
I would make an argument, actually, that our conclusions are not that different.
They certainly are in terms of, they are not different in terms of warning about a future dedicated simply to personal prosperity and peace, as my dad would put it, because you've gone there too.
I actually think, and this is something that I walked away from this book feeling, which surprised me, to be honest, which is when I don't think that there's a left operating in the world. I think that it's been wiped out, but that's neither here nor there. Liberals, Democrats, whatever we want to call them, right? I actually think that both sides of the aisle have an understanding, and they're talking about the same thing, but they're seeing it through a completely different lens. We understand that the modern world doesn't work. And there's a reason why the modern world doesn't work. And I'll tell you what, Republicans, evangelicals, whatever, even apocalyptists will say that the modern world doesn't work because religion has fallen out of favor, right? Because that operating gravity is gone, and we've lost that, which, by the way, is what you and your father were saying, which I think is right. I actually think that there is some truth to that. But my argument is not that, because I think the Christianity that we're talking about is a heretical sect of it. It has been bastardized. It has been changed. It has been mutated and weaponized. My personal belief is that we have to rediscover faith. We have to rediscover a spirituality. We have to move past the rationality of neoliberalism. The idea that I am just a product, you're just a product. And by the way, if we were actually neoliberals, you and me, Frank, we couldn't talk. We couldn't. We would be competitors. Why would we ever help one another? Why would we ever have
because the operating philosophy of Tesla, SpaceX, Starlink, all these Musk companies, all the tech companies, et cetera, is really just, again, in a continuation of, a new set of supreme beings who are somehow fated by for whatever reason to dictate the fates of we ordinary mortals. But you haven't gotten away from a divine right of kings in a way. We're still back at square one. I just want to remind people you're listening to and or watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer. I'm Frank Schaeffer. I'm an author and I do things and commentate. And this is a friend of mine, Jared Yates Sexton, who's written a really good book, The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. And I just want to jump forward in that book just a tiny bit here and read something from it that I think will set up a question that I want to ask. In the nearly 5 years Cromwell, that's Oliver Cromwell in Great Britain, ruled as Lord Protector, England was a military theocracy, its society dominated by repressive Puritan Protestantism, whose authority was enforced by the New Model Army and its generals. The reason I pause on that passage from your book, and I'm sorry to jump around a little bit here, is that we live in a day and age where people like Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court and the conservative Roman Catholics she's with, which Cromwell would not have liked because they're Roman Catholics, but that aside, really have the same point of view. They're not using the New Model Army, and they're not murdering tens of thousands of Irishmen, but they are using the U.S. Supreme Court to enforce a real Cromwellian view of we can only save America if we get back to God's will for this country, which is a conservative Protestant, conservative Roman Catholic vision, not just on issues of women's rights, abortion, and these other things, but really the whole shape of society, up and including, and here's a weird wrinkle these days, the carrying of weapons of mass destruction and high capacity, rifles and all the rest of it by ordinary citizens to hold in check this sort of neoliberal idea of the state as imposing things that, the people don't want, or that will limit corporate power and all these other things. So you even have a kind of a revolutionary Cromwellian idea within Amy and these other people on the court, accepting a certain level of public mayhem and chaos in order to bolster their worldview. Let's just go there for a minute, because it's very much in line with where your book's at. And then I want to dive from there into the last half of the book and the conclusions about the neoliberal consensus, because a good bridge is the toleration of violence and civil unrest for some greater purpose, which they also see in terms of some sort of theocracy.
Well, and I'm so glad that you brought this up, because Cromwell's such an interesting figure, right? Cromwell leads the New Model Army. And by the way, like, it's not like they were just like going along with the plan. The New Model Army was itself a revolutionary idea.
Right.
That it should restructure society. Within the New Model Army, there are even conversations about more democracy, about more republicanism, about leveling the playing field. Meanwhile, you have a demagogue in Cromwell who uses that populist movement to go ahead and gain authoritarian power, which is what has happened in the United States of America. It is not, again, like a New Model Army that have like matching uniforms and they're out there going from battle to battle. We now have a faux populist movement in the United States of America of people who understand that things aren't right, that understand that this is not a fair society and that something has moved in the wrong direction. But like Cromwell, what the Republican Party has done is they have used that dissatisfaction. They've used conspiracy theories. They've used the billions of dollars paid by people like the DeVosses, by the Kochs, by the Bradleys, all of them, to create a faux populistic conspiracy theory motivated movement that has allowed them to take power for their own ends, or
try to hold on power in a very Cromwellian moment of calling the mob to storm the Capitol, to sustain this divine inspiration vision of God has put this man in charge to shake things up. And so we are going to use the force of arms or pepper spray or whatever it might be to enforce God's will over and above the law of the land.
And by the way, for anybody at home who's like, why are we talking about England? Let's go ahead and talk about the United States of America. Right. Prior to the founding of the country, a anti-papist conspiracy theory that started in England, and by the way, led to the overtaking of the British Empire by the Dutch, which is not history that we get very often. It led to the overthrowing of the government of Maryland. Because of anti-Catholic conspiracy theories. And it worked the exact same way. Powerful people used this conspiracy theory within the United States of America to overtake a capital. And this is always a cycle that we continue to see. It's not a coincidence, by the way, that this is the move that continues to play out. It is the authoritarian playbook.
Well, and the source for so many evangelicals, if you want to go back to the beginning, or should we say the transition from the United Kingdom to our shores, and you have in your book, since Puritan John Winthrop had christened Massachusetts and its colonizer project in 1630, quote, a city upon a hill, and placed it in the center of God's plans in the New World, the colony and its population lived in certainty. They served on the front lines of spiritual war. And that is the bridge to our moment of history. On that side of the story. Now, here's what I love about your book. If I had written your book, that's the point I'd be making, that continuity. And then I would run out of steam. But you then flip it. And I want enough time to go there. And you say, yes, this is a problem. And the Francis Schaeffers of this world and Frank Schaeffer, as he helped him out in the 70s and 80s, are the problem. But we have bigger fish to fry now, because Winthrop would look at the technocrats of the neoliberal elite, the kind of folks who were sitting in Davos in the last few weeks talking about all this, or Musk and all these other titans of industry, whose idea is that somehow they have not been divinely put in power, but that somehow, I don't know how to put this, whether they believe in fate or whatever it may be.
Oh, they do.
Very much like the Roman emperors, that this is their moment of history. And in the kind of Ayn Randian tradition of the great man, removed from any kind of theology or anything, really believe that they are superior beings and that they are going to lead us to colonize space or whatever it may be, but that democracy is a stumbling block. It is in their way now. And I'm very much of the mind that they are very much like the industrialists in the years of 1930 to 33 in Germany, who were the only reason Hitler came to power legitimately, by the way, through election, because up until that moment, there was a functioning democracy in Germany with courts of law and all the rest of it. And it came apart in literally only 3 years.
Yep.
30 to 33. Those are the years that matter. Everything after that is a footnote. It was, that's when the fates were, locked in. And I think our industrial capitalist base right now, the titans of the tech industry, all these other folks, these international globalists and the rest of it are very much in the same position.
Yes.
They don't like democracy because it is inconvenient to the speed at which they want to move, and also their freedom, their transnational freedom to do what they want. So let's get into the last third of your book.
So I'm so glad you brought this up. I want to go ahead and introduce, I'm sure some of your listeners know this, a phrase that I think sums it all up, which is someone getting high on their own supply. Right? This is a group of people who have made incredible amounts of money. And I want to go ahead and set the scene. Facebook, Twitter, PayPal, all of those things, Amazon. These are incredibly successful businesses, but they're not successful because these people are somehow or another more talented or more brilliant than everybody else.
Right.
The times demanded them. Somebody was going to do this, whether it was Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, you name it. But meanwhile, it's that ideology, Frank. It's that idea that we're talking about. How do these people sleep at night, right? They have to tell themselves a story. Obviously, I am a man of history. I am a religious type figure. And they've even created their own ideology, long-termism, right? Which says, I need to gain as much power and as much wealth as possible. Trillions of lives, not billions, trillions of future lives, the entire future of human civilization.
Well, like in the movie Don't Look Up, which tried to make this point to some extent, the figure who stands in for Jeff Bezos, probably, or Elon Musk, whoever they're parroting best, says when called, you're a businessman, he says, I'm not a businessman, I'm evolution.
Yes.
Like it's much bigger than just business. This isn't about money. I'm leading the human race to the new promised land. I'm evolution.
And by the way, it is a secularist religion. It is how Christianity has been absorbed into capitalism and how capitalism absorbed Christianity.
Well, you have a good point you make on page 238 of your book. And you're referring to something else, but you can explain what this quote better than I can, called the Chilean miracle. It was a real world example of how neoliberalism would function. Ideology would be limited and ideally eliminated. And I would say so would democracy, by the way. Politics and government would be separated from the economic sphere, which would be left to the technocratic, quote, experts. The market would be absolutely free and unrestricted, allowing the people to either prosper or fail. Without government intervention, power at the ballot box was replaced with consumer sovereignty, meaning votes were relatively useless, and the consumer made their preferences known with their purchases. For the market, it was fantastic. For the people, disastrous.
And by the way, that is the whole thing. Neoliberalism is its own secular religion.
It is.
We watched it fall apart in 2008, and all of the people, these great priests, including Alan Greenspan, they had no explanation for why things fell apart, but they continue to believe. What do we call that, Frank? We call that faith. Right? Yeah, exactly. That's when a cult leader takes someone out and says the end of the world is nigh, and the next day arrives, and they continue going forward. They have created a secular religion that, by the way, is a classist, eugenicist, discriminatory religion. It believes that they are the saviors of humankind and that democracy is incompatible. And what you brought up is really important, and what I tried to talk about in this book. This is the exact same scenario that happened in the 1930s because the industrialists who created the industrial age, they were given tons of money and power. They overtook the governments. We looked up and all of a sudden our societies didn't work anymore because there was too much concentrated wealth and power. And then when things fell apart and people wanted to change things, what did they do? They took their power, they took their wealth, and they gave it to people like Adolf Hitler.
Yeah, and you talk about the fact how this happened here, and you say, the marked divide between the elite and everyone else inspired a new era of mystification, is what you call it. And of course, that was the same thing that happened in Germany. And, it took a different form, but we're very much on the edge of that here, which I think the Midnight Kingdom, this idea of standing on the edge of an abyss is very much a through line in your book, but I don't find it a kind of an apocalyptic vision. I find it simply a truth telling about a certain thread in history, because you can't do everything, but that has very much brought us to this moment.
Well, and I agree. And I just want to use one quick example. Sam Bankman-Fried, who recently, of course, lost billions of dollars, and like
Yeah.
this, people like him have been lauded as saviors. They used to bring Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg in front of Congress,
and by the way, from the left and the right.
Yes, absolutely.
Because he was going to do all this good for left-wing causes, and he's going to be this great thing. It's an equal opportunity employer here.
The only argument that's happening right now is how to use these technologies and who are the saviors. If anybody has time over the next couple of days, go and watch Bill Clinton and Tony Blair with Sam Bankman-Fried. And both Clinton and Blair are like, I don't understand how this works, but we just need to stay away from it, which is a priest class. We're not supposed to understand the algorithms. We're not supposed to understand how the economy works. We're peasants.
And you say this right here near the end of your book. The self-styled messiahs of big tech offer digital and futuristic salvation, but that's only another mythology. That's what you say.
And by the way, what is the metaverse, Frank? It is a utopia. It is a heavenly place where all of your dreams will come true. You won't be limited by your mortal bodies. It is simply another religion that has taken the place of everything else because neoliberalism hollowed out all of our meaning. It just turned us into capitalist little cogs in a machine, and we're not supposed to have meaning. That's for people above us. We have the toil of peasants. It's neo-feudalism, and we're arriving in this point where they're actively rolling back liberal democracy and liberal society that we have been living in, and they're trying to get back to a feudal corporate state, which we've seen.
And which, by the way, the defenders of Elon Musk say, thank God for him, because he's reestablishing what they call bossism.
Yes.
And this is to curb the excessive feelings of joy in their own employees having been given free sushi and allowed to use tricycles in the hallways, and all this other infantilizing bullshit that's coming crashing down now as they fire 10,000 people at a time to prepare for what they see as an economic downturn for a while.
They are a stylized version of a caste system. We even see this when we talk about homeless people. You talk about San Francisco, everyone's like, oh my God, can you believe all the homeless people in San Francisco? They're not talking about human beings. They're talking about inconveniences, people that they have.
And you can see this because they are supposed, a lot of these corporations are Americans, and these are American people living here, and yet have worked effortlessly with the Chinese Communist Party. And by the way, inconvenient little fact here, with the caste system in India, in the sense of working with their elites as well. In the good old days, they'd be opening factories in South Africa and happily working with the apartheid system. There's no question.
None.
That's the case. None.
And to go ahead and draw this around, part of what's happening right now with this international authoritarian movement, I'm sure you saw this. The New York officer in charge of counterintelligence got busted working with a Russian oligarch.
Sure,
of course
absolutely.
He did.
Yeah,
they're well. That's why Saudi Arabia is able to do whatever they want.
No problem. Saudi Arabia and if Putin had not attacked Ukraine, Germany would still that same hierarchy in Germany would still be making billions off importing energy to Europe through Russia. Never mind that he's murdering his opponents left, right, and center.
They would welcome him back like in a couple of weeks.
Tomorrow morning.
We've already seen these articles that are like, how soon can Putin be brought back into the G7, right?
Yeah.
And part of this is that, and this is the moment we've arrived at. This is why the book's called The Midnight Kingdom. People like Vladimir Putin, and including Alexander Dugin, who is his ideologue. That's
sure. Which, by the way, I love the Dugin passage. I had a whole series of quotes to go there, and then my mind is saying, Jared has a heart out at the end of this thing. Let me conserve my time here because I love the Dugin thing. Just tell future readers of this book, when you get into the Dugin bit, you're going to understand something you hadn't understood before. That said, let's move on.
They see right now, the right wing sees that this current status quo is hollow, brittle, and it's ready to fall apart. And by the way, Frank, they're right. They are not.
That's why Bannon had so much traction with so much working class people, because to that extent, he was telling the truth.
And we've arrived at this point where basically the expressions of the market, the Republican Party is the authoritarian expression of the market. Right. Go and die at your job during a pandemic.
Right.
Feed them into the mall. The Democratic Party has become the defenders of the status quo. They're not offering an alternative vision. There is no alternative vision of how things can get better, which is why faux populism takes over, which is part of this international authoritarian movement. And my personal belief is that we have to rediscover, and again, I say spiritual. I don't mean necessarily religion. It can be. You can believe in something higher than yourself. That's fine. we have to rediscover that we have something special inside of us, that we're not just workers to be fed into the maw of a pandemic, that we're not just numbers on a stat sheet for people like Sam Bankman-Fried or Clinton or Blair. We have to rediscover that there is something better about ourselves than this grist that we're in. And neoliberalism has erased meaning. And it's, as a result, it is a midnight kingdom. It is on the verge of falling apart. The only thing that can save it is authoritarianism. That's it. That's the only thing that can reinforce it. Looking something like China, right?
Yeah.
I personally think it's going to turn out okay. I think we're going to win this fight, but we have to understand that there's a fight to win, which is what a lot of people are
your point is well taken, because if you look at, say, what's happened to Tesla since Musk's takeover of Twitter, and the way that kind of ripped the veil off for a moment of the man behind that particular curtain. One of the things everybody suddenly wakes up and says is, why is he so deeply in bed with the Chinese Communist Party? How come they're all getting on so well and chasing exactly the same ends across the planet? And of course, that's sort of the point, isn't it? That's what you're saying in a way.
Yeah, and by the way, it doesn't matter if he loses money. Like, the system is completely set up to keep him afloat. Like, the corruption that we're talking about from Russia, from Saudi Arabia, from these oligarchs, it's the exact same thing. This system is built on a house of cards that depends on the wealthiest individuals, particularly white wealthy men, to continue to prosper. There's a reason why Donald Trump lost more money than anybody else in the United States for years and still became president of the United States of America. Like, so
given the fact we're closing in on the last 10 minutes of this, in conversation with Frank Schaeffer, with Jared Yates Sexton, who has written this really important book that I would like you all to rush out and buy and order today, The Midnight Kingdom, A History of Power, Paranoia, and the Coming Crisis. By the way, anybody reared on my dad's book, How Should We Then Live, that wants to help your mental process recalibrate itself a little bit, this book is the most direct kind of answer I've read in a really wonderful way. That said, I'm going to give you the last 10 minutes here, and this is going to be a funny thing, but you come from an evangelical background. So I'm going to start by just saying, preach it. And please give me the sermon that both evangelical white American Christians and our neoliberal friends working for Google, or those who still have jobs left, need to hear, because it really is the same sermon. And you've got to start talking about the conclusions you draw in this book and this call to some higher ideal of human existence, which I think your book calls us to, which transcends this Roman through line of power and elitism over the rest of us, and brings us hopefully to some sort of new place. Now you have 10 minutes to preach it.
Well, I want to be very clear about something, and I want to ask people at home to think about something. Is there ever been a product or a promotion or a profit that has ever made you feel actually something that was real? And what we have been doing this entire time is we have been working in a fear-based economy, a fear-based world. We are told that, if only you buy the right car, if only you get that promotion, if only you get that raise, if only you get the next brass ring, that something inside of you, it'll move and it'll fix and it'll be whatever. And that is a sickness that we all have. We have been led to believe that we are evil, that we are wicked, that we are wretched, that if anybody knew who we actually were, they would reject us, right? And we would be cast out of society and everything would fall apart. There would be a collapse, an apocalypse, more or less. That is intentional. Since they discovered the works of people like Sigmund Freud, who understood that there was some sort of an interior world that we had that was in conflict with the rest of society, they said, you know what? That's fascinating. That's going to be great for selling toothpaste. We're going to make you believe that you have to buy the right toothpaste or else you'll never find a mate. You'll never find happiness. You as a person will fall apart. And by the way, for any Google workers, for any tech workers, you have been busy with technology that was supposed to be, again, a religious type iconography. You were supposed to change the world. Why are you still chasing these things? You have been sold a false bill of goods. And by the way, if you think that you made it through this round of layoffs and that you're going to be fine in the next one, this system chews everybody up except for 1% of the population. And real fast, Frank, I just want to point out in the last few days, these new AI programs, artificial intelligence, what are we reading articles about? They're going to get rid of skilled labor. They're going to get rid of the logistics workers. They're going to get rid of the creative class. Everyone says, oh my God, how could they get rid of us? This is the way the system works. It was designed to exploit you. It was designed to make you feel terrible. There is a better way. There is a better future. And I have to tell you, it's going to involve risking things. It's going to involve risking your careers, risking your life, and more importantly, by the way, risking your own view of yourself. You are more important than the things that you own. You are more important than the luxuries that you enjoy. You are more important than the restaurants that you go out to eat in. In all of this, there is a better world where we can feel healthier, where we can feel more connected, where we can have more of an actual purpose in our lives. Neoliberalism is brittle. It seems large, right? Because it's a technocratic web that, as Wilson told us, right? We're supposed to look on in awe and wonder like a god, right? Don't ever bother the stock market. Don't ever bother the deep state, whatever we want to call it. It is so brittle and ready to go. And the main antidote to all of it is solidarity. It's to see in one another. Frank, I see that you and I are part of the same thing. Right? Mm-hmm. There are moments of intimacy that we have with everybody where we look in another person's eyes. We understand that they're like us, that they're made of the same things as us. That solidarity is what will break this down. The paranoia, the self-destruction, the self-hate, the self-loathing, the fear, all of that can be erased and we can move forward. And I would go ahead and say, not only can we move forward, we have to. We have no choice whatsoever because we now have an authoritarian threat that threatens to take us back to feudalism, but with technological, like Chinese type authoritarianism and surveillance. And on top of that, I hate to tell you, but we have wrecked this world. We have wrecked our environment, and it's only going to make things worse. Seeing people on the southern border get put in cages, separated from their families. We don't talk enough about this. They sterilized them, Frank. They forcibly sterilized climate refugees, right? How bad is it going to get as land shrink, resources shrink? We have to get on the right path. We have to reject this neoliberal secular faith, and we have to find a faith that there's something important between me and you and the people listening to this.
And I would add, people, this sounds a little bit hokey, but in this case, I'm not asking you to send me money to fix the world. I just am asking you to read Jared's book. Because it's really important that we have to start thinking about this. The Midnight Kingdom, I think, is an antidote to years of misinformation coming from the evangelical right, the conservative Roman Catholic Church, and this is the weird linkage you won't find in most books, our new lords and masters in the high-tech industry and everything they represent, whether it's the Chinese Communist Party making deals with Tesla or whatever it may be. Again, Jared's book is unique. There are lots of books unpacking, like my memoir, Crazy for God, Unpacking a Journey Out of Evangelicalism. That's part of the book. There are lots of books about the deficit in the evangelical right-wing view of history and an answer to the Roman Catholics' idea of theocracy and so forth. But I don't know another book that lays the foundation to see a through line from the Christianizing of the Roman Empire all the way through to the neoliberal elites running Tesla and SpaceX and all the rest of it. That's a very unique contribution. So please look out for Jared's book. I don't usually ask people to buy the books of authors that I talk to, even the ones I like. But in this case, you really do have to make this book something that folks read, especially all those indoctrinated by people who have read my father's work and other things. And I'll just finish up with one last thing, Jared, before we go out here, and then I'll give you the last word. Yesterday, I had one of those little choices. I was supposed to be on a call with a bunch of executive types in corporate America doing something important and interesting. And I just picked up my granddaughter, Nora, from school. And there was a book on the table that I was reading out loud to her. And I said, look, I've got to go do this podcast thing. Not this podcast, but somebody else's. Well, I didn't do it. I just stayed there and read her the book. Yep. And I voted, I voted with my feet to sit at my kitchen table and read her something my beautiful little 8-year-old child was interested in as she was sitting there eating fresh mangoes and shrimp I'd grilled for her on my wood stove. And basically it was like, no, I'm voting with my action this afternoon. And I didn't explain anything to her, but it was more than simply following my heart, because I would rather be there. And I would have been angry in the other call thinking, why am I here doing this when I could be there, rather than talking to all these important people. And that's a choice I'll never regret. And I think that sort of fits with what you're saying. And I'll give you the last word.
I couldn't agree more. And that touches me. And by the way, Frank, you humble me. This and I want to point out what you're talking about there. It's recognizing what's important. It's intimacy. And there is something in us. There is a fear in humanity that like we're going to miss out on something, or we're going to fall apart if we don't do this, or if we don't continue to do it. It's recognizing what's real. It's recognizing what is important. And I thank you so much. Again, you humble me, my friend, and I always enjoy talking.
Hey, last 2 minutes. How do we get the word out about your book? What do we all do to get this thing read as widely as possible? I'm doing what I can here. I'll do more. But how does it, I mean, we can all get in touch with you because we're going to link to you everywhere this podcast goes. No one will have trouble following up. But Jared, in the best of all worlds, what can the rest of us do who want to get your word out?
Word of mouth. I mean, this I understand when you pick this up off of a shelf, it feels like it's a big dense thing. It's the entirety of history retold again. Tell people what we're talking about. Tell people about this. Same thing with what you do with Frank's work. Just tell people that they need to understand this stuff and that they need to move forward with it.
Yeah, and I would just add one more sentence on this, and that is, once again, this is a remarkable book, and the through line into the present and into our new Roman imperial world, in which our new emperors in the tech companies, but not just tech, the entire system, are now using and abusing everything that they were handed by both the legacy of the Roman Empire, the through line of the bastardization of Christianity into a powerful group of people of defending self-interest, and now the final capitalist iteration of our masters. Jared is the first person who's made a condensed, well-written argument against this. I haven't seen a book like this. And I would ask everybody who listens to this podcast to take me on this one. Please get this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank.